It's now my great honor to introduce the next chapter in our journey. Talking about a new mental health culture would not be complete without addressing social justice, racism, and violence. Our first speaker is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco. She teaches mindfulness as a practice of awakening and awareness. She's the author of the book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves, Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. Please welcome someone I admire very much, Rhonda Magee.
Hello, hello.
Rhonda,
Good to
it's
be with you.
so good to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Likewise, likewise. It's wonderful to be with you, Cassie, to see you today.
So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about how you see first of all, this has been just an unprecedented year of not only the COVID crisis, but many societal crises, including, you know, a number of murders of Black people, a number of Black Lives Matter protests that ended in violence through terrorism and, police brutality. Tons of things have been extremely upsetting to our collective culture, but especially to the culture of Black and Indigenous and people of color. Tell us more about how you see the inner work of racial justice connecting with mental health overall.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for this question. As you just alluded to, many of us have, in this last year, been uh, awakened to some of the conditions of Black life that are difficult and have been actually, for generations. And those conditions, those incidents that you're naming, whether it be violence, whether it be, incidents of bias and racism that threaten actual violence, they live in our bodies as routine, um, persistent distress incidents that cause us to stress. And so, a lot of data confirm that uh, Black, Indigenous, and people of color um, suffer disproportionate instances of mental health um, distress. And so, yeah, these incidents that we talk about and we see, we can
Mm.
understand them through a lens of social justice, through a lens of morality, through a lens of education. Right? We think we might educate our ways out of this, but I do think it's important to bring this mental health lens to recognize that um, these conditions. Being so prevalent and showing up in not just one incident here or there, but in these patterns of incidents that end up leaving people feeling all of the consequences of more or less traumatic and regular
Mm-hmm.
uh, reminders of, frankly, the vulnerability that's associated with being a racially marginalized person in any kind of culture. And so, yeah, this mental health lens is really important for us to understand some of the ways that these incidents are actually impacting our brothers and sisters, our colleagues at work, um, many members of our community, and thus consequently have impacts on all of us.
It's so true. And, I've seen a social media hashtag, for example, that says, hashtag I am not okay. And I think we have to be really careful about putting a mental health or a mental illness diagnosis when sometimes these are not abnormal reactions to a normal situation. These are normal reactions to abnormal situations.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. So we've got to be careful about how we think about it. Um, they are, I think you're absolutely right, totally predictable reactions. And yet they're just there's indications of some distress,
Hmm.
right? So really your comment there is inviting us to think about how we define something as simply a mental illness, as a problem that of that individual that needs to be fixed. um, so you can have both signs and symptoms of overwhelm and moving out of balance and homeostasis, right? You can have those indications, but those indications may be less about the individual somehow having something inherently wrong with them,
Mhm.
and more about a sort of a distress signal that the entire society might do better to take into consideration. That is to say, we might do better to look at what are the circumstances and conditions
Mm.
that are giving rise to these indications of distress. And so seeing not just a kind of an individual micro level inquiry to be brought to bear, not just what's going on with that person and I am not okay, but that and all right, what are the circumstances and conditions in our communities, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, in our broader world that we might shine more of a light on with this question of how are these circumstances and conditions contributing to the mental health distresses that folks are experiencing and reacting to or responding to in completely predictable ways. And the other thing I'd like to suggest is that we often think about the mental health aspect of this as something that let's say the target of oppression or identity based bias or violence may experience,
Mhm.
but actually to be thinking about the mental health distress of those who perpetrate these kinds of harms, or the sort of mental health imbalance that drives a culture of othering and of kind of fear of the other, and scapegoating
Mhm.
that can be some of the dynamics that give rise to this kind of violence and bias and distress on the part of the victim who's targeted for those behaviors.
Absolutely. And, you've been someone who's really brought forth the idea that mindfulness can be a help to some of the trauma that people experience in a culture of racism and oppression, but also, and more importantly, perhaps, to people who are implicitly involved in the culture of racism to be able to become mindful of their own biases.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for pointing that out. For me, it's like all of mindfulness practice. That is, it's available to us to help each of us discern what I use the phrase personal curriculum, like what's called for me, like based on what I'm, the circumstances I find myself in, the habits, patterns, and conditionings that I'm able to, with the support of mindfulness, see more clearly and disrupt more effectively. And for each of us, that looks different and will be different. And so, yeah, depending on our particular positionality in our culture, in our social systems, in the social world, again, each of us is of course, experiencing this world differently. And for me, the beautiful thing about mindfulness is it's available for each of us in our own unique ways to explore, what is called for me right now. What In what ways am I getting stuck? In what ways am I, maybe either resisting some information that's trying to be, uh, coming up for me to know and engage with? In what ways am I attaching to some notion of the good, the beautiful, what's
Can you
true,
tell me what?
that is getting in the way of me, again, engaging more effectively with what's here? In what ways am I sort of moving through the world in a fog? Each of us certainly has our own personal curriculum, personal work to do around this. And for some of us, that means how am I, healing from the wounds of living every day in a biased society? For others of us, it may be how am I healing from the coarsened heart, or the pattern of not seeing, right, the support for not seeing, that I need to wake up to be able to be more of an ally, or to work more effectively in solidarity with others who are suffering more directly. So I sometimes think of it as like those who are suffering directly from bias, those are suffering who are suffering more indirectly, but we're all suffering in different ways, and trying to look at and see how mindfulness can be this beautiful, I call it inner technology and inner resource for working with the suffering that we're facing.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Rhonda, for joining us. Thank you for your bravery in this domain. And please check out Rhonda's book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. Thank you, Rhonda Magee.